All right. Hello, everyone. I am Becky L. McCoy. I'm the Communications and Outreach Coordinator for the Brian Dagle Foundation here in Niantic, Connecticut. I know quite a few of you are local to here, and there are a few new faces here today. So look forward to getting to know you a little bit better. So let's jump right in and find here we go. Okay. All right. So we'll start with our opening meditation. Tonight we'll have a poem. We have our guest with us, Charlotte Donlon. So she'll present and talk for a little bit, and then we'll have a Q&A and conversation, discussion. I'll introduce next month's speaker, and we'll have a closing poem. So here's our poem to begin. It is from the collection of poems by Mary Oliver called Devotions, and it is called On Meditating, sort of. Meditation, so I've heard, is best accomplished if you entertain a certain strict posture. Frankly, I prefer just to lounge under a tree. So why should I think I could ever be successful? Some days I fall asleep or land in that even better place, half asleep, where the world, spring, summer, autumn, winter, flies through my mind in its hearty ascent and its uncompromising descent. So I just lie like that, while distance and time reveal their true attitudes. They never heard of me and never will or ever need to. Of course, I wake up finally thinking, how wonderful to be who I am, made out of earth and water, my own thoughts, my own fingerprints, all that glorious temporary stuff. And I wanted to share this poem tonight because as I think about our time together, I hope that we can all, or at least the thing that's been the most significant for me about meeting with you all every month is just that spirituality. It's the process of things. It's not whether we can meditate and be good at it, but what do we discover while we meditate or do any of the practices that we've talked about, or and that grief in itself is such a spiritual experience, and that when we focus on the process of the grieving and of the healing is when we experience some really wonderful and awful things, and but that's when we grow and that's when we heal. So I was really excited to stumble on this poem again today. I hadn't read it in a while. Come on. Here we go. Okay. So tonight I am very excited. I feel like I say this every month, but I am always excited to share this speaker with you, Charlotte Donlon. She is a writer and a spiritual director. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Catapult, The Millions, and elsewhere. Her first book is The Great Belonging: How Loneliness Leads Us to Each Other, and I will make sure that you have a link to that in the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. And you can subscribe to her newsletter and connect with her on Twitter and Instagram. So, Charlotte, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I have to make sure I'm not muted, even though I just unmuted myself. Thank you, Becky, for inviting me to join y'all tonight. I'm excited to be here, and I will tell you that when it is time for the Q&A portion of the program, I am a pretty wide open book. So if you feel like you want to ask something, but you don't want to offend me, it's very hard to offend me when asking me a question. So all questions are welcome when it's time for that. I'm going to start with reading a portion of an essay I wrote in 2020, following the death of my father a few months before my first book came out. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the loneliness and belonging of grief that I've experienced, and then end with an invitation for you to view loneliness as a way to deepen your belongings, and as a way to discover the ways that you belong. So this is a portion of an essay from the Christian Century, titled, "My Dad Died from COVID-19. My Grief is a Lonely One." In a voice message from my dad that I saved on my phone, he tells me what I need to do. Just hang in there. Do what you're supposed to do. Rest. All that other stuff. Drink fluids. Sleep, sleep, sleep. Love you. Bye. The message is 15 seconds long. I received it a few years ago while I was sick with the flu. When I listen to this message, I hear my dad's accent, formed by his Detroit childhood and his deep South adulthood. I hear the humor and lightheartedness that could make me smile even while I was ill. I see him in the cozy recliner in a corner of his den, rocking gently, one or two dogs in his lap, his 65-inch TV on but muted. My dad didn't leave this message because he thought I needed him to tell me what to do. He just wanted me to know he was thinking about me. That's what he did. He thought about me. He thought about me often.
That's really beautiful, Charlotte.
Yeah, I'm trying to not cry.
No, well, hey,
Okay,
you know what? We are literally a
tears
center for
it's
grieving
hard
adults.
for me to
Yeah.
it's hard for me to talk and cry at the same time. So I'm trying to get through this one portion. So
Okay. Yeah.
okay. I found the message on my phone the night my dad died from complications due to COVID-19. He was in a hospital room in Panama City, Florida, with my mother and my aunt by his side. I was on the sofa in my living room in Birmingham, Alabama, with my husband and my 2 teenage children. We were separated by a few hundred miles in a pandemic that insisted I stay away when everything in me wanted to be with him. I stayed on that sofa for a week. During those first days of heartbreak and grief, I did what my dad told me to do a few years before when I had the flu. I drank water, I slept, I remembered that he loved me. That was in early August, but in truth, I had been grieving for 15 years, ever since my first therapy appointment. My therapist told me that I had experienced many things over the course of my life that were very messed up, and that I needed to grieve the brokenness I knew as a child, an adolescent, and a young adult. I had lived my whole life convincing myself everything was okay, but everything was very much not okay. And many of those things that were not okay required grief and tears. The thing is, once you begin to grieve the things that are worthy of tears, you can't stop. I started grieving that day, and I cried several times a week for 2 years because I kept remembering events, conversations, and trauma I had ignored or denied. Then I skip ahead. I talk about Christianity and grief and how Christians aren't very good at grief. And then this is how I end the essay, kind of turning to an experience of belonging with my grief. My first experience of parental loss came with a new and significant sense of isolation. It isn't just that my dad is no longer physically present. This new loneliness surfaced when I realized this is a grief that only I can carry. I'm his only daughter. He didn't watch any other daughters dance a different role in the Nutcracker every winter. He didn't explain the rules of football to any other little girl on game day. He didn't walk anyone else down the aisle on her wedding day. I'm the only person he loved in the ways he loved me. He's the only person I loved in the ways I loved him. Plenty of other people have also been grieving my father's death. None of them knows my grief. None of them knows the particular ways we belonged to each other. The unique relationship I had with my dad has created a lonely grief, but it has also created a secret belonging. My dad and I shared a lovely secret language about ordinary things that others might have deemed boring or inconsequential. I hold the unique memories of the curiosities I shared with him throughout my whole life before his death, just like I hold the unique sense of sorrow I've known and will continue to know in the weeks since he died. One afternoon in October, I whispered to my dad, asking if he's ever noticed how the yellow butterflies always fly in the same direction, how they are always coming from the same place and moving toward the same destination. If I'd been able to call him, he would have responded with curiosity. He would have Googled it. He would have asked me questions. What shade of yellow are the butterflies? What size are they? We would have realized together that the butterflies I noticed are most likely cloudless sulfurs, and they were flying in the same direction because they are migrating before the cold weather arrives. We would have said how cool it would be if the butterflies that passed through Birmingham also passed through Panama City on the way to their destination in South Florida. And we would have said something along the lines of, what else are we missing? I didn't get to talk about cloudless sulfurs with my dad, but I do get to talk about them with other people. I get to write about them. The way my dad and I belong to each other still lives when I know people are listening and seeing me and knowing me. I can depend on that as I depend on the rhythms of the natural world, like cloudless sulfurs migrating every October. When my mother, brother, husband, and all those who are grieving my dad in their own particular ways feel pulled toward despair, I can tell them that what he would say. Just hang in there, do what you're supposed to do, rest, all that other stuff. Drink fluids, sleep, sleep, sleep. Love you. Bye. Okay, thank you. Let me find y'all. So that's an essay I wrote when my dad died, or more accurately, probably a couple of months after he died. When you write a book about loneliness and belonging, and then 2 years later, when the book is coming out, you're in the middle of a pandemic, and then your dad dies from COVID, you tend to see the whole situation through the lens of loneliness and belonging. So I had never thought about grief or the loneliness of grief or that particular loneliness of grief, in that when we lose someone, it is a unique loneliness that only we feel. I had not ever thought about that until my dad died, even though I had grieved losses and deaths and everything before that point. So writing this book, The Great Belonging, How Loneliness Leads Us to Each Other, gave me a lens through which to see COVID, to see loss, to see death that I had never had before. That's a gift to me. It gave me other gifts too. But when I think about the loneliness of belonging, and the loneliness of grief and the belonging of grief, 3 years later, almost 2.5 years. I'm sorry, I'm so confused. 2 years later, I think about how when we lose something or someone, the things that fill the gaps. And I have always navigated loneliness ever since I was a child. It's been something I've had to navigate. And one way I view loneliness and one way I view belonging is through the ways we belong to ourselves, each other, the divine, and the world. And whenever we have a diminishment in one of those areas, one way to belong and to feel less alone in that loss is to enhance and increase the belongings we still have. So if I belong to myself, others, the divine, and the world, and I lose my dad, which was one way I belonged to someone else, the belongings that filled those gaps for me primarily were through my work and how my work helped me belong to myself. And how my work helped me belong to other people who are experiencing similar situations, and how my work and the art that I make and engage with helps me belong to the world and to God and to others. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'll try to explain it a little bit and invite you to think about the same ways or similar ways that your losses have opened up new belongings. And I'm not saying this in a way to like dismiss the loss we experience or to minimize the loss we experience. I say this as like a way to survive the loss that we experience, and just one way that I've survived. So, sorry, let me find where I am in my notes. Okay. As I said, the new belongings for me after my dad died appeared most abundantly in my work as a writer and a spiritual director for writers. Practically, this looked like doing the work that I feel like my full self, like more like my full self when I'm doing my work. So when I'm writing and when I do spiritual direction with other writers, I feel like I am inhabiting a fuller version of who I was made to be. And I was able to kind of lean into that as I was grieving and navigating the loss of my father. When you are practicing spiritual direction during a pandemic, you will notice patterns in what people are experiencing. And some of those patterns may be what you're also experiencing. And it was super helpful for me to have a very up close, to be a witness really to other people's experiences through the pandemic. So while I was sitting with them as a spiritual director, making space for my clients to notice God in their creative work and in other areas of their life, I also was able to see how I was not alone, because my clients were experiencing some of the same things I was experiencing as a human being living in this world during a pandemic, and as a writer living in this world during a pandemic who didn't know when she was going to be able to write again, because how do you write when everything's shut down and people are dying and you're afraid to leave your house and all of those things. So the grief that I experienced was also common for them. And as a spiritual director, you don't talk about yourself a lot. I do a lot of listening as a spiritual director, but it doesn't mean I'm not benefiting from what they're saying or not able to feel less alone. So that's kind of like a secret reason of why I do the work I do, is so I feel less alone in my creative work and in my life as a Christian who's trying to navigate the spiritual world and the physical world and the emotional world, just like my clients are. So another way that my work helped me belong was through learning to talk about faith with clients who didn't share my Christian beliefs. For some reason, I ended up having a lot of clients who aren't Christians, and I'm 100% comfortable with that. But when you're talking about how we belong to God, or when you talk about the soul and spirituality, I needed a common language for that. And being able to talk about the loneliness and belonging of the different things we were experiencing, and one of those huge things being grief, I was able to connect with clients and make space for clients to explore their own kind of soul level things from a familiar, like commonality, a place of commonality, because we may not all be able to put words around what we believe from a spiritual standpoint, but we've all experienced loneliness, and we've all experienced a disconnection from ourselves, others, the divine, and the world when we grieve. And so having like a common language of belonging and loneliness in ways that help me talk about spiritual things with my clients was huge for me. And it has shown me even more so the things we all kind of have in common, the things that are familiar to all of us, regardless of our faith backgrounds and our spiritual traditions and those sorts of things. So clients that don't even know what they believe from a spiritual standpoint, but they are interested in, quote, spiritual things, are able to tell me how they experience loneliness and belonging in their writing and in other ways they engage with art or in the death of a loved one. And I'm just really thankful for that realization this early in my career as a spiritual director, because it has helped me be welcoming to all people. Like, I can honestly say that any person who's interested in the work I do as a spiritual director is welcome to meet with me, but even if we don't believe the same things, or even if they don't know what they believe or whatever. And that has been a huge gift that I believe my experience of grief and the loneliness I've experienced in grief, where I needed to find belonging through my work, helped me notice. And I don't know if that makes any sense to y'all, but it makes a lot of sense to me right now. And then another way, let me see, I think I had one more. Okay, that one doesn't count. So I have talked a lot about loneliness and belonging, and how experiencing loneliness in one area can open up belongings in other areas. And I think one way to kind of explain it a little bit more is just by reading the introduction to my book. So I will read that now and then open it up to questions about loneliness, belonging, grief, and loneliness and belonging, or anything else that comes to mind that might have nothing to do with any of those topics. Okay, this isn't very long. Sometimes I wonder if loneliness resides in an extra secret organ within the body, maybe the size of a plum, a storehouse of dense alienation hidden deep within us. I wonder if God knew we'd need a special place for our loneliness because we would have so much of it. Everyone knows loneliness. Some may experience it more often. Some may find relief from it more quickly. Some may deny or avoid it. But I don't think any of us escapes its company entirely, and I'm no longer sure we should, though I spent many years trying to outrun loneliness and her cunning charms. Indeed, being a human requires a touch of loneliness. None of us will ever be fully known by another person. None of us will ever fully know or belong to another person or even to ourselves. That doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying to know, be known, and belong. Rather, it means we can accept loneliness as a normal companion. We can inhabit a posture of curiosity when we recognize loneliness and our responses to it as part of the human condition. We can wonder how our different forms of loneliness and our belongings are connected. While I was finishing this book, we were sheltering in place at home because of a global pandemic. Loneliness of all kinds spiked. Many of us began to wonder, is my relationship with God affected by my inability to visit my best friend? Is my relationship with myself affected because I can't chat with neighbors at the grocery store? Is my relationship with my husband affected because we haven't been able to pray, worship, and take communion at church? As everything begins to settle into different patterns, we can be curious about our new belongings. We can ask, even though our familiar belongings are shifting and fading, what new belongings are being formed? What are some of the new ways I'm belonging to myself, others, and God? We can dip our toes into the waters of loneliness and test the temperature. If it's comfortable or bearable, we can dive on in. If the water seems too cold, we can wade in slowly, one step at a time. When we are submerged and ready, we can swim around and discover how it feels to move toward and through the deeper waters. And we can do all of this knowing we can climb out of the water at any time. We can dive for the bright plastic circles of insight laying down deep on the bottom. We can float on a raft and consider the shapes of the clouds in the blue sky above. We can notice who else is in the water with us. We can study their strokes and determine how long it takes them to get from where they are to where they want to be. And together we can make our way to whatever might be waiting for us. Thank you for wading into the waters of loneliness with me. I pray we arrive on the other side full of hope. So thank you. I hope that this kind of brief exploration of connections between loneliness, belonging, and grief will help you navigate your own loneliness and belonging of your own grief, and maybe even help you know you aren't alone in your grief and you aren't alone in your loneliness. The end. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlotte. And I love Charlotte's book. It's one of those books that I would get. I will always continue to to give to people, because it really has been a comfort and a really positive perspective shift for me. So thank you for your work and your words that you continue to share with us.
Thank you. And thank you for being a place where I can cry while reading an article I wrote about my dad. Like, if there's ever a space where I can feel safe crying, it's right here. So
yeah. Yep.
I'm glad I did that. Thank you.
Yeah. Glad you did too. Well, we have lots of time for questions and discussion. So, and when Charlotte says she's an open book, she means it.
Hi, Charlotte. I'm Lisa. I'm in Guilford, Connecticut. And you said something that really struck me. You said that work helps me to belong. And then you also mentioned about filling in the gaps of loss and loneliness. And so I lost my son 5 years ago, and I have done like everything you're supposed to do, except for like electroshock therapy. I think that's about the only thing I haven't done to feel better. And so I realized after a few years that it's really just that I am alone in this, but also that it's just something I have to learn to live with. I can't change it. I can't drink my way through it or take pills or run or do anything else except to learn to live with it. So what could I do? So I had a lovely career for 30 years. I'm a magazine editor and a writer and a registered dietitian and all kinds of things. And I stopped working a few years ago for health reasons. But I thought maybe if I worked, I could kind of fill in the gaps. So I go to a nursing home 2 days a week, sometimes 3, and I work in the kitchen. And just my boss knows that I'm a registered dietitian. I'm a dietary aide, which is like the lowest you could be, but the best, because you get to be with the people and just bring them their food, an extra apple strudel if they want it, and talk to them. And I get to work with really nice people. I don't need the money. They pay me, but I'm not doing it for the money. And I've been there since February, and I can't believe what a difference it's made in my life. It's crazy, but I miss it when I'm not there. And it does, it feels your term, filling in the gaps, couldn't have been more spot on. And I want to thank you for recognizing that, because it's really true. For me, it really worked.
I love that. Thanks so much for sharing how that resonates with you. And I can imagine you right now. I'm like seeing you take people nourishment and extra apple strudels. And I love that picture and that image. And Yes, it's definitely a very personal application of how the gaps are filled in. I can imagine how people who hate their work would be like, no, there's no way my work would ever help fill in any gaps. And my point with all of that is to determine what fills in your gaps. And I'm so glad at least one person on this Zoom gathering also feels that their work meets their loneliness in that way and their grief in that way. And yeah, I want to read an essay about that. I want to know more. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Mm.
What are some ways that you have helped yourself to identify what your loneliness is and like where you feel loneliness and where you feel belonging? I think sometimes in grief it's hard to identify where the gaps are even.
Yeah, for me it was noticing my energy levels and my capacities to be with, like, to give away my energy was huge for me. And again, I'm not sure if it's due to like pandemic grief or grief from my dad's death or all of the above. But I had to learn to pay a lot more attention to my body and the sensations of my body and my need for rest and how different things affected my energy levels and my need for rest. And I tie that directly to my experience of grief and the things that give me energy and deplete my energy and that help me feel like I belong and that help me feel disconnected. So for me, the signs are always usually in my body and energy levels. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I just had to personally, for me, I don't want to say this is a formula because I don't like formulas and they don't ever really seem to work. But once I began to pay attention to the things that gave me energy and helped me feel less alone in the world, I was able to return to those things more often. It's kind of like just a way of viewing how I take up space and time and noticing, do I feel like I belong right now or do I feel more lonely right now? And those things can change, but some of them are very consistent. Writing and reading books and reading poetry and whatever will always make me feel like I belong to everyone and everything in myself and the world and everybody. Being at church can sometimes make me feel very alone. It can sometimes make me feel like I belong. It just depends on the situation. Liturgy with the prayer book and the Episcopal tradition makes me feel like I belong because it's ritual and it's familiar and it's repetitive. And I know what's coming and I know when it ends, like things that I'm familiar with help me feel like I belong. I think it's a very personal kind of unique, like a thumbprint of what helps us feel like we belong and makes us feel lonely. Although there are some commonalities, I do think it's very customized and unique. And it's super important for people to determine and be in touch with those feelings of. And if you don't know what loneliness feels like, here's a list. Maybe that will help. Should I read my list?
Yeah.
The list is helpful. This is a good list. Because loneliness might be occurring when you don't know the word for it, or you think, well, I have a ton of friends around me, or I have a ton of family, I have a ton of people who love me, who I spend time with, but you still feel kind of different or othered or whatever. So I put this list in my book called Occasions of Loneliness. And I'm just going to read all of them. There's 20, but I'm not going to read the number because it messes up the reading. You wake up in a strange place. You wake up in a familiar place with a beloved one lying next to you. You long for your childhood home. You long for your grandmother's home. You long for somewhere you've never been. You're sick on your birthday. No one remembers your birthday. You're a new employee in a new office and you plan to eat lunch alone. You're on the outside of the inside jokes. You have a secret that you will never tell. Your older sister leaves for college. Your oldest child leaves for college. Your best friend's wedding. You visit a new church for the first time. You visit a new church for the second time and the third. Hospital smells, hospital sounds. The anniversary of your mother's death, your husband's death. You remember that you forgot the anniversary of your mother's death. You turn out the lights before going to sleep when all you have left are yourself and your thoughts. So those are some occasions of loneliness that you might not know are your loneliness. Does that help, Becky? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah,
A little bit.
I think especially, I think grief just messes up the ways that we experience so many things.
That's a good point.
That we can, I can think of what it felt like to be lonely as a kid. And that feels like a really tangible thing that I can explain to people.
Right.
But the grief of, like, I'm thinking that at the end of this month on Halloween will be the 10th anniversary of my dad's death. And just thinking about the loneliness of being the oldest of two kids and now having my own kids and none of us having our dads. And that's just not something that a lot of, right? Because my husband has died, my dad has died, my father-in-law has died, like my grandfather, all of our grandfathers are gone, like, and there's a loneliness to that I mean, I guess at first I had a hard time calling loneliness, but I think that's the perfect word for it because there's no one else in this boat. It's just, I'm the only person who understands this experience.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a description of what loneliness feels like in their grief?
I can say for me, I mean, I've had a lot of losses in my life. Back, my grandparents, and then my mom when I was a teenager. My dad, right before COVID, he passed away. But what brought me to Brian's Healing Hearts was my son passed away in 2019. He was 34 years old. And I have one other child who's older, but he's quadriplegic. So one of the things for me, for a loneliness piece, has been I'll never be a grandma. I'll never. My sisters are Mima, Momo. My brother is a grandpa, and I'll never experience that. So, before my son got sick, he died of brain cancer. But so it was before we had no idea he was sick. Thanksgiving of 2017, he was in Maine, and he and his wife were trying to get pregnant. They were trying to have a baby, and I was all excited, but they were having difficulties, and I don't know any details of the difficulties. So we were there for Thanksgiving, and right the day before, I think I had found out that my brother was going to be a grandfather. And of course, I have no idea that what's coming, thank God. But my son and my daughter-in-law were so upset that this nephew of mine was going to be a dad. They weren't married. They were been together since they were like 12, on and off. And like, I thought they had just broken up recently. And here we find out they're pregnant. And so it wasn't like, oh, yay, they're going to have a baby. But it was, there's a new baby coming in the family. But then like a couple months later, my son is diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. This pregnancy is going on. I couldn't go to the baby shower. It was one of those, I couldn't do it. I'm like, I can't go in there for this baby shower. I wasn't happy. You know, I mean, it is what it is. I wasn't excited about it. The baby was born on the day that my daughter-in-law gave my son this huge birthday party up in Boston. And, you know, we're all there knowing it's his last birthday here on earth. And this baby's born, this little boy. And I met him a couple months later, and he's the sweetest little baby. And he's now 4. And he has been my biggest healer in my grief. He is an old soul. There's no doubt about it. And he loves me to pieces. And I love him back just as much. And I'm not his grandma, but I'm his great aunt. And we spend time together. And he thanks me for coming, you know. And I'm not a person who considers myself creative in any way, stretch of my imagination. Artistic, not so much. And he loves sea creatures and sharks and all those good things. And he asked me to draw. He has a song he sings about, you know, this fish got eaten by this fish, by this, you know, and I have to draw them all. So I Google how to draw them and stuff. And the next time we did it, and he said, you don't need to Google it. You know how to do it. You know, and he's like healing so many other pieces of me. I mean, I can't even, I have a tattoo on my arm, my wrist, because I had told my son to please send me cardinals to my yard. And so I have a cardinal. And Finn, my little great nephew, he knows that the bird is there because I lost Justin, but you know, he's 4. I told him, you know, it's because I lost, you know, I had Justin, who I love very much, and he's gone now. And so I think he thinks I had a bird that died, and that's okay. But one night, he now has a little sister, and he came up to me and he sat on my lap and he goes, Aunt Sue, my sister is a girl. I said, oh, she is. So she likes unicorns and butterflies, and I don't like them. And he said, I don't know if she's going to like me because I like sea creatures and things. And I said, well, you know what, Finn, I didn't like them. I didn't like sharks until you taught me about them, and now I like them. And I said, so she'll like them. And I said, but maybe you can find something different that you like together. You can each have your own thing. And I said, like birds. And you like birds, don't you? And he goes, well, I like some birds. And he goes, that bird that Justin is, he goes, I don't really like that bird. He goes, like out of the mouth of babes, because I don't really like that bird. He goes, but when I see one, I say, hi, Justin. So
That's adorable.
how can I not love to pieces that little boy that I didn't want to like? Yeah. Just like he does, you know, he doesn't want to like butterflies and unicorns. I didn't want to love him. Yeah. Because I was jealous, I think is, you know, and then especially when, you know, I wanted my grandchild, but I have this little boy. I mean, I don't have my son here, but I have this beautiful blondie little towhead with a mop of curls that loves me like as much as he loves his grandma and his grandpa. So you know, yeah, I have that lonely hole in my heart of I'm not going to be a grandma, but I have this little boy that, oh my goodness gracious, I didn't know I would ever be able to love a little person like that again, especially him, the poor little guy. But yeah, I do. So that's my story of my loneliness in my grief, and you know, where I'm, yeah, he'll always be a very, very special little person to me, even when he's probably 6'5" or something, you know, someday. But yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Charlotte, I wanted to share when you talk about belongings, because it's resonating within my mind of how many people say new beginnings. And I've never liked new beginnings because I want to keep the old me and the old ways and the old loves. And I'm really appreciative of when you say belongings, because the new belongings allow me to keep the old belongings too, and to just go on to include body, mind, and spirit of new belongings rather than beginnings, because beginnings mark endings to me. So I'm really resonating that my loneliness can keep my grief alive, but can also bring me to new belongings and keep my old belongings. So I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. Oh my gosh. We're all like, wow, yay. We can keep our old. We don't need
so good,
beginnings.
Martha.
Well, I think in pictures, and I live in the world as a spider web. And I've had a lot of griefs and losses from early in life, but I keep moving as a spider in the world from one part of the web to the other, but I never want to let go, even where the grief and the sadness is. And I might move from a grief spot to a lonely spot, but I never want to leave the old behind, and I never want to let it go to a new beginning, because that means I got to jump off the old spider web. Yeah. So I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm resonating with this, a new beginnings versus new belongings. And it's just rich for me. So I want to thank you for that. My soul is resonating with the new belongings. Because
now mine is too. Thank you. I'm so glad you mentioned this, because now my mind and soul are like thinking about how truthful, like I think you just put words around something that's very true for all of us here in some way. So thank you so much for that.
Well, your sign says keep showing up.
Yeah.
And whether it's in body, mind, or spirit, we're made for each other.
Yeah.
We gotta belong. So I want this to end so I can get on Amazon and order your book real fast.
Thank you.
Speaking of books, do you have any favorite, whether be other books or resources or podcasts or speakers or writers or exercises or whatever, when it comes to looking at spirituality and belonging?
I'm probably gonna have to send you a list for that email.
That's okay, because I'll send out a follow-up email. So that's
okay. Yeah, I have a few, but I'm terrible with titles and authors. I will say that poems are kind of my go-to, mainly because they're short, and when I'm grieving or feeling alone and have less energy for things, a poem with 6 lines can feed me for hours. Yeah. And and it doesn't have to be a poem about religion or spirituality. It's just when someone puts words around something that I know is true that I didn't have language for before,
Mhm.
it does something to me that I love. So I will say one poet who is one of my favorites is Ada Limon, who is our national poet laureate right now. And
Oh.
one of her books is this one right here, The Carrying, which I've returned to often over the past few years, but she has a new book out that's amazing too. So I might send a list of poets, a few other books. I'm also a huge fan of fiction because novels help us, all kinds of art helps us hold multiple and complex emotions at the same time that we can't necessarily hold in and of ourselves, which is one reason art has helped me belong and survive. And when I say art, I mean all kinds of genres and forms of art, books, movies, TV shows, music. So practically, when I think of grief and spiritual things, I think of art, and there's a lot of just blurry lines between spirituality, art, loneliness, and belonging for me. There are just a lot of blurry lines there. And oftentimes I'm trying to say the word poem and I accidentally say the word prayer. I'm trying to say the word prayer and I accidentally say the word poem, because it's all just kind of the same to me sometimes. So it's a very long answer to your question. I will send you a list, and please engage with as much art as possible because it will only help.
Yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about that? That's one thing I love to hear you talk about, is just the different ways. What does it mean to engage with art, and that, when it comes to spirituality and belonging? Because I mean, we've talked about that. Just I've done some spiritual direction sessions with Charlotte, and one of the times she told me, go to a museum and go look at some art. And I remember walking into the Lyman Allen like, this is a big crock. I am not going to experience anything significant today. It'll be great to just look at art, right? Like, that's always a good day. Like, I don't need to come away with anything. But it ended up being this like incredibly profound experience that shocked me.
Well, I'm really glad it worked.
It did.
Yeah. So in writing The Great Belonging, I wrote a bunch of chapters. And then when I was putting the book together and figuring out the structure, I realized so many of my chapters were about art and how I experience art and different forms of art. And through that process, I was able to recognize that art, so while we have these primary belongings of belonging to ourselves, others, the divine, and the world, there are certain things that deepen our belongings. And for me, one of those things is engaging with art. And the other one is connecting to my place, like the places I live and my homes and like physical spaces I inhabit. So there is a section in The Great Belonging about how art helps us belong. And for me, a lot of the research I've done is basically like what I mentioned before, that it's like art, and whether it's a painting or a TV show or a novel or music is a big one for me. There's mainly like music specifically is a really good example, because you can have a memory of a song from when you were a child. And like I have this one Chicago album is very much connected to my dad and his like sound system. And I remember being very young, 3 or 4, at this one house I have early memories from, and listening to this album. And so when I listen to that particular album, I am in that house as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old with my dad. I am where I am now listening to it. I am the night he died when I was listening to it. I am in the future, 10 years when I listen to it. It's like, it helps us connect our past, present, and future selves in ways that are kind of mysterious and also very real. And it's just it's like a song that that helps us belong to different versions of ourselves and different versions of people we love and different time periods. And it just feels like a way to be a fuller version of me as a person. Does that make sense? So that's just one way, but also the idea that, you know, a novel with a beginning, a middle, an ending, where good beats over evil, like good wins over evil, or someone who has a similar struggle to you figures out a creative way to, you know, overcome it. Like it just kind of opens up new worlds and new ways to process things that we experience. Or maybe it's just a way to escape all the things that are, you know, going on inside our hearts, minds, and souls, and gives us just a break from all of it, which is also, I mean, that's kind of what movies do for me. When I sit and watch a movie, for me, that's more escapism, which I love. And it's wonderful to escape all of the things I'm worried about. I took my, I stayed with my friend's son this past weekend. He's 14 and had like ultimate frisbee practice and all this stuff while his parents and other siblings were out of town. So I stayed with him and I was basically his Uber for the weekend. But one thing we did was go to that new Minions movie. And I was like, oh, cool. Like it was just like playful and fun and hilarious and made me laugh. And also just a good story. And, you know, elements of good and good mixed with evil and evil mixed with good. And maybe it's not as cut and dry as you think it is. And I don't know, I just think it's a very powerful way to feel less alone in the world is when we engage with art. And I know some people talk about how making art helps you feel less alone. I am more of a proponent of engaging with other people's art to feel less alone. Although making art helps me feel less alone, but engaging with other people's art takes less energy because you just show up and put yourself in the way of it. So I'm a fan of like doing the one that takes less energy. So
Yeah.
I hope that I just rambled a whole lot. I hope that makes some sense to people.
Yeah, it's been a huge shift for me in the last few years. And I think grief brought me to the place of being open to this, that grief and spirituality, it's about the process, right? It's not about going and sitting at the museum in front of a piece of artwork and being able to list the 3 things I learned today, right? Or the 3 things that impressed me, or like it, you're not going with a tangible goal. You're not grieving with a tangible goal. You're grieving, you know, when it's healthy grieving, you're grieving because along the process is how your heart mends and how you know, recognize the love that you had for this person. And when we allow it to be about the process of grieving, the process of healing, the process of sitting with art, the process, that's when it becomes this really wonderful healing thing, as opposed to when we have the mindset of, okay, like when should I feel myself again? Like I should feel back to normal. My grief should be over. You know, what is the result? And being focused on the result instead being focused on the process
I love that.
has been really meaningful for me. And I love how that just creates this like really fertile place for belonging to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think when you focus on the process, when I do, it helps me be more present in the moment and pay more attention to the things around me and the things that I might miss if I'm focused on the outcome. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like when my dad died, I noticed nature way more. Like I talked about these butterflies. Like, I don't know if I would have noticed those if he hadn't died. I wouldn't have noticed that every time I went for a walk, I saw butterflies, right? Like flying in the same direction, like coming from, was over the course of a few days. I'm like, there's more of those damn yellow butterfly. Like, what are they doing? Why are they here? And I noticed a tree I had passed dozens of times on this one street I used to walk up and down in a former neighborhood. I mean, I had seen this tree for a year, and a few weeks after my dad died, I noticed the bark was like this lacy pattern, and I've forgotten the name of the tree, but I had never noticed it before. And I think like being present to the process of grief opened my eyes to the moment, the present moment in some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And not that it's always wonderful, beautiful bark. Like sometimes it's very painful present moments, but it's like when I inhabited the present moment of the pain, I could also inhabit the present moment of those butterflies and that bark and whatever else was around me. It's like my senses were a little bit more, more heightened for some reason. I think I tweeted about that once, like when, like my grief heightens my senses. And I know for some people, they're like, well, it deadens mine. And I don't know, like, it's just different ways where I'm not saying it all happens the same way for everybody, but for me, there's a heightening when I'm grieving because I'm more aware of the present moment and more aware of what's happening in that process. I think it's somehow connected. So,
yeah. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions? Good night, Todd. Thank you for joining us.
I have to dash too. This is Paula. Thank you very much.
Yes. The rest will be available in your email tomorrow.
Appreciate it. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
All right. Before we close, I was thinking the last few days that we should take a few minutes to practice and examine. And then I thought, no. And then as I'm sitting here, I feel like it needs to happen. So, the examine is something that Saint Ignatius wrote and was known for. And I think this conversation of loneliness and belonging lends itself to taking a couple minutes to kind of reflect before we wrap up. Usually it is practiced to kind of focus on your day and reflect on your day, but I'm going to reword it a little bit just to kind of focus on this time together, and what we've talked about. And then we'll wrap up. So feel free to be comfortable, feel free to turn off your camera, do whatever is most helpful to you. And just kind of take a few deep breaths. You want to begin by just becoming aware. Be aware of your body in the space that you're in right now. It can be becoming aware of the space around your body. Just be really aware of the moment that you're in. And as you are focusing on that awareness, start to bring your awareness to the presence of the divine, whether that is a God or the universe or something that you don't quite know what to call it, but whatever that thing that you feel is bigger than yourself. And if you don't feel that presence, that's okay too. We're just being aware, all about the process. Now you're going to review the last hour or so that we've had together with gratitude, with curiosity, pay attention to what it brings up in your heart, in your mind, in your soul, the things that you want to know more about. Pick one of those things, and we're just going to sit with that one thing for a little bit. One idea that stuck out to you, one question that you have, one thing that you wish you could believe or experience, but you're not quite sure about. You can meditate on the idea, you can pray about it, you can just kind of let it flow through your consciousness. Whatever feels most natural in the moment. Notice what's happening in your body, in your heart, and your mind as you reflect on it. Remembering that you don't need answers or outcomes, just noticing. And as you finish up your thoughts, your prayer, your meditation, you're just going to look toward tomorrow. Look towards the way that your grief and your loneliness pave the way for belonging. You can take a few more moments, take some deep breaths, become aware of your body and the space around your body. Thank you for doing that with me. Felt like, I don't know about you, but I needed a moment to just let it all soak in a little bit. So thank you, Charlotte, so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for everyone's, those who were able to put words around things. That helps me learn a lot about loneliness and belonging and grief too. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Yeah.
Very nourishing to me.
I'm going to cut out now, Becky. We'll see you next time.
Yes. See you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, let's real quick as we wrap up. Our final thought for the evening is a poem called Journey by Nikita Gill. Compare your journey to no one else. You are counties and stories already. You are a million different ways. You are forests and forest fires alike, a ship and the sea together. The only person you must compare yourself with is yourself. Your journey is your most powerful story. And I am really thankful for all of you who continue to share your stories bit by bit. So next month, November 14th, we will have Robert Monson. He is going to be speaking about grieving while Black. And I encourage you, if that's a title that feels like maybe it doesn't apply to you, to come anyways, because he is a tremendous human being who has experienced a great amount of loss and just continues to approach life with so much joy and gentleness that I continue to just be in awe whenever he shares. So he's a musician, a writer, a podcast host, and a seminary grad that looks at Black liberation theology, womanist theology, and becoming soft in a cruel world. So that's what we have for tonight. Tomorrow you'll get an email with the recording, and you'll get a list from Charlotte and I kept note of any other books or anything we talked about. So you'll get all those resources too. And as always, I really enjoy this time with you all. It's really wonderful. So have a lovely evening.